This is discussion number 3, Informal Amendments of the Federalism Chapter. The previous discussion was about formally amending the Constitution. But there are ways that we have amended the way that our government does its business without putting an official change in the Constitution. And so based on the actions of different actors within the government has established then a way that maybe didn't necessarily get written into the Constitution, but that's the way it's done. The first way that we're going to talk about is simply through legislation. The Constitution says that the United States shall have the power to tax. Okay? What kind of tax? Who gets taxed? How much is going to be taxed? That's not written into the Constitution. And so therefore Congress, when it passes legislation and says this is what's going to happen in order to collect a tax, and this is who you charge taxes to, and this is who you don't charge taxes to, creates the Congress's idea of what they understand the Constitution to mean. And so therefore it is their interpretation that establishes what they believe the Constitution to mean, and as it is accepted and exercised, becomes something of an informal amendment. Now, a president, when they commit an executive action, they do something, they're doing that based on their understanding of the Constitution and what they understand their powers to be. And so therefore, it is what they consider to be constitutional. One idea, we have the idea of an executive agreement. Now, in the Constitution, it says that if there's going to be a treaty between our country and another country, the president has to agree to it, and then the Senate has to ratify it. But what about, one president talks to another leader and they say, we really ought not to do this, or this would be a good idea. I mean, did they all get together and sign something and make it an official treaty, or is this just an understanding between two different foreign heads of state? Well, in that case, if it's just an agreement, that is considered to be an executive agreement, and that's not mentioned in the Constitution, but it's a way that the president acts that adds substance to the way that the government works. Now, we also have Supreme Court decisions. Now, Supreme Court kind of has a more upfront way of informal amendments because it's their responsibility to read the Constitution and then to interpret the Constitution. So it is their duty in order to try to create more of a sense of what the Constitution is and or ought to be, depending on your philosophy of judicial power. So again, their court decision says, actually, let's go back to the freedom of speech. What are you allowed to say? Are you allowed to say anything at any time? Well, the Supreme Court actually has said no. For example, they say you cannot yell fire in the crowded theater and say that's protected free speech because it is obvious that that's going to create a situation where people are going to become frightened for their safety. There's a possibility of people being trampled and killed or at least injured. And if you're just doing it just to have some kicks and have some fun, then you should be able to be held liable for your dangerous actions. And so you don't have an absolute freedom of speech. Another idea that adds an idea of informal amendment to our Constitution or the way that our government operates is the existence of political parties. Now, when the Constitution was being debated and was signed and then sent out to be and just as it was being sent out to be ratified, there was no such thing as a political party. I mean, you had people that were for it and you had people that were against it, but there was no organizational effort in order to make sure that one group of people got elected versus another group of people. And so the idea of party practices, for example, how does a president get nominated to run for president? The whole process of nomination is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. And so the way the political parties operate is not in the Constitution and therefore is an idea to look at. And a last way that we have an informal amendment to the Constitution of the way that it's done is simply that someone started it and no one's thought to challenge it. For example, for a long time, if the president died, and we had a few of them going on up through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, that the vice president would become the president. but it doesn't necessarily say that in the Constitution. And there had been some debate, especially when some vice presidents ascended to the presidency. Is that person the vice president who is simply fulfilling the ideas of the president? Is the vice president lose the title and become the president? Or is it just a temporary hold until someone else gets elected? That had never been established until it got written into the Constitution in the 1900s. Also, another idea was a no third term for a president. This, for a long period of time, had been an understanding. George Washington served 2 terms. Everyone thought that he was the world's greatest president, and then he said that's enough. And so every other person who ran for president, did a second term, and they said that I will follow the example of George Washington and not run for a third term. However, there had been some times where people tried to run for a third term, and the people themselves and their elections said, by not voting the person in, that we accept this idea that there really should be no third term. If George Washington's only is good enough for only 2, then everyone else should be only good enough for 2. Now, that changed when FDR was president, and we were looking right in the eyes of World War II, and he was elected to a third term and even a fourth term. He didn't serve much of that fourth term, however. Now, when he died, then the United States Congress made it a congressional amendment. They proposed it saying that no president would be able to serve more than 2 terms, and then the states ratified it. So that is now an official amendment, but for a long time it's just kind of the way things were being used and operated. This concludes discussion number 3, the Informal Amendments of the Federalism chapter, which includes chapters 3 and 4 of your government text.